he started out studying creativity, right? Flow emerged out of this study he was doing of talented artists. He was going in and observing painters painting, and he noticed that they could give a shit about the painting once they were done. They were just into the process. And what's going on here? Like, that violated everything we thought we knew about extrinsic motivation and human motivation, and it just didn't make any sense. But why he started that study wasn't like, I'm hunting for flow. It was, I want to understand where ideas come from, how you create something out of nothing. And I always felt that his book Creativity is just a masterwork on the subject, and a masterwork on sort of how humans think creatively. And I've probably read every book, every science book or psychology book written on creativity at this point in innovation, and it still remains, up there with it's number one as far as I'm concerned in terms of like the books that I think about it. I'm like, oh, this is really useful. And I don't mean useful in a scientific, neat idea kind of way. I mean useful in a how I steer through my daily life kind of way, which I think always his great contribution is he took psychology and philosophy and made it very, very practical. I also think, he was a great 20th century thinker. And what I mean by that is there were certain big ideas that people in the 20th century thought a lot about. Ethology, the study of animal behavior. He was very influenced by everybody from Conrad Lorenz and Mary Ainsworth, John Bowlby, who formulated attachment theory, all the way up to kind of the more modern ethologists. And that was very present in his work. So was evolution. And thinking about, he was part of the group of psychologists. And this is another thing that he's never given credit for, is there's a field of evolutionary psychology that emerged in the second half of the 20th century and hugely influential on how I think about flow, also hugely influential on how my wife and I created Rancho de Chihuahua and our healing methodology with animals, like on both levels, right? Csikszentmihalyi was obsessed with evolution. The evolving self is his look at how does evolution create human beings, and knowing what we know about how evolution creates human beings and how flow works, how do we come up with a life that means something in a society that means something? But it was an inquiry based around evolutionary theory. He was also, I thought a lot about, oddly, complexity. He was, even though he didn't work in that field at all, he definitely, was part of the group of people to realize, oh, wow, complexity, the brain is a complex system, and that the rules of complexity are going to apply here as well. And even though he never pursued this later on, I remember being shocked because I thought this was like one of the things that I helped bring to flow science a little bit. And I was so sure this was like one of my contributions, and then I, stumbled on something that he wrote, in the late 80s. And I was like, yep, he beat me here too.
Well, that's actually really funny you mentioned complexity. There was a quote on creativity I wanted to share and get your thoughts on. And it goes, if I had, and this is obviously from Csikszentmihalyi, if I had to express in one word what makes creative personalities different from others, it's complexity. They show tendencies of thought and action that in most people are segregated. They contain contradictory extremes. Instead of being an individual, each of them is a multitude. So very, very curious for your thoughts on that quote. And then just his contributions to creativity and your takeaways personally from his contributions to creativity specifically.
You actually landed upon one of his great contributions to creativity, which is his understanding. And Mike and I had a disagreement over this, actually. He believes these traits are hardwired early on, and like the creative personality may be a fixed personality type. Though he does say, interestingly, when he did his giant study of creativity, some extraordinary number, like 50% of his study group, lost their fathers or suffered really serious hardship in early childhood. So it's not just, he does acknowledge there's a nurture component that really weighs in creativity. And we can come back to what his thinking about why that matters in a second. But his idea of the creative personality type, the fact that creatives are both and. You're very, very introverted for the actual creative act, but you're very extroverted when you kind of present it to the world. You have to be very, very naive to believe that your creativity is going to work. And yet you have to be very, very sophisticated to sell it to the world and actually make a living as a creative. And it back and forth and back and forth. I think there were like, in creativity, I'm going to get it wrong, but there's something like 17 or 19 different both and binaries that creatives are. And where I think this is so important to anybody who trains with us or anybody who does flow work in general is, and this, I think what the adult development research continues to show is that, one of the things that happens is as you get more access to flow, you get more access to divergent thinking. You become more creative over time. You learn how to think more creatively over time. And especially if you're doing flow work and you want to use creativity in that pattern recognition, linking new ideas together as a flow trigger, which is such an accessible flow trigger in almost any situation you're in, you'd be a fool not to try to maximize it, right? Like if you're interested in this work, I think what happens is we actually develop these both and personalities. I think that's part of the path towards adult development. In fact, a lot of the work I'm doing on peak performance aging based on the kind of some of the early research done by Gene Cohn, who's he was a geriatric psychiatrist and the founder of the successful aging movement, and built a couple of the big national aging labs and things like that. He has found these same things that, as our brains develop later in life, we start to gain access to like creative superpowers, right? Levels of creativity, ways of thinking that we don't have earlier on. So even if flow doesn't make us more creative over time, life is going to make us more creative over time. We're going to have a successful second half of our life. And I think that these both and personality types are harder for people because what you get is more emotions, especially in the beginning. You're going to get way more feelings than you're used to because you have to open up parts of yourself that you don't want to be creative. It requires that sort of deeper vulnerability with yourself. And I think I think there are emotional control issues. This is one of the things one of the reasons I wrote Art of Impossible is we were training people in flow. It was very easy to train up flow because the triggers worked so well, the cycle worked so well, but it wasn't stable in a lot of people. They'd get these huge spikes and they'd return to baseline. And one of the reasons is there were creative skills that they needed to master, but also emotional regulation skills. And I think those skills are really important because as we become more creative, we become more emotional. I think one of Mike's biggest contributions is that he saw this sort of writing on the wall before a bunch of other people and, was poking at it through flow and through adult development. And I think it's gone further now, but I think that's really important. I think that's what that quote speaks to, but more specifically, the term complexity means something very specific in adult development. Complexity in common language, we would call it wisdom, right? It's being able to see things from multiple perspectives. It's being able to, understand that very few things are black and white and most things are gray, and understanding that you have biases and there are noise and judgments and all that stuff gets folded under what we would call complexity. But it basically means you're growing up, you're wiser, and you're moving up the adult development chain. And it also seems to mean, though more research needs to be done, also seems to mean you become way more flow prone. Like going through these gateways, what you get on the other side is a lot more flow, which is interesting.
If what you've heard on Flow Research Collective Radio has been helpful, please consider doing us a solid and leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening to this. Reviews help us connect to a wider audience so we can get these peak performance principles out to more people.